Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Major Joseph Bowman of the Illinois Regiment, Virginia State Forces, and I am your most humble and obedient servant. Now, I would like to tell you the story of the history of the conquest of the Northwest Territory and our glorious revolution against the British. Before I begin, I would like to first state that I am a person of the past, and even though I lived in my time, I am well aware of the events and circumstances of your time and all the events that have transpired between the two. So from time to time, I may use more modern examples to better explain the circumstances that I'm trying to communicate from my time. Now first, let's define what we mean by the Northwest Territory. In my time, it was called simply the Northwest. In your time, you refer to it as the Old Northwest because in your time, the Northwest is the Pacific Northwest in Washington State and Oregon. But in my time, it was simply the Northwest. In the region that we're talking about here is all of modern-day Illinois, all of modern-day Indiana, all of modern-day Ohio, all of modern-day Michigan, including the Upper Peninsula, all of modern-day Wisconsin, and this little sliver of northeastern Minnesota. That is what was called the Northwest Territory. Now, in order to understand the history of the Northwest Territory, you first have to go back to the end of the French and Indian War. Prior to the end of the French and Indian War, there were no white British settlers that were living west of the Appalachian Mountains here. If you were west of the Appalachian Mountains and you were white, you were French. This entire region had been discovered by the French, it had been explored by the French, and it had been settled by the French. And all of these towns that were in the river valleys and around the Great Lakes were French. Even after the French lost the French and Indian War, the French citizens were allowed to stay in their communities, provided that they renounced their allegiance to the French king and signed an oath of allegiance to the British king. So they were allowed to stay. So all of these towns down here, Cahokia, Kaskaskia, Vincennes, Prairie du Rocher, St. Genevieve, they were all still culturally French. There might be some British explorers and trappers that would make trips across the Appalachian Mountains, but they didn't live there permanently in settlements. The only people who lived west of the Appalachians were French. That changed with the end of the French and Indian War. France now has to abdicate its government in North America, but as I explained before, the French citizens were allowed to stay in their towns. And now, Americans, particularly Virginians, start to settle this Trans-Appalachian region. There was a very rich area that was known as Kentucky. That was spelled C-A-N-T-U-C-K-E-E. And we got that name because that was what the Indians called it, Kentucky. It was a very rich bottomland. There was a lot of cane land associated with it. It was very good ground, very fertile for farming, and there was abundant game there. And no Indians lived in Kentucky. It was a common hunting ground that all the tribes in the region shared, but none of them lived there. And when we started settling west of the Appalachian Mountains, we were attracted to that region for the exact same reason that the Indians were. So we start settling Kentucky by leaving Fort Pitt, coming down the Ohio River, and settling in Kentucky. Now this starts putting pressure on the Indian tribes that used Kentucky as their hunting ground. They didn't like us being there, and they complained to the British government about it. Now the British government was very sympathetic to their complaints because remember, the French and Indian War had just concluded, and even though the British won, it had nearly bankrupted their government. So they did not want to start a new frontier war against the Indians when they hadn't finished paying for the last one. And keep in mind that the taxes that the British started imposing on the American colonies at the end of the French and Indian War were to pay off that French and Indian War debt. All those various taxes, the Townshend duties, the Navigation Act, the Stamp Act, the Intolerable Act, those were all things that 10 years later would manifest themselves in the American Revolution. But that was what they were trying to raise revenue for, was to reduce their war debt. So they were in no mood to start a new war on the frontier before the last one had been paid off yet. So in order to pacify the Indians, the king's ministers drew a line across the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, and they called it the Proclamation Line of 1763. And it forbade any American settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, keep in mind what the Appalachian Mountains are. These are not foothills. They're nowhere near the size of the Rocky Mountains that we would encounter later in our westward expansion, but these are mountains. And not only are they mountains, they run from Georgia down in the south up into New England in the north, and they're very heavily forested. The British had absolutely no ability to enforce their proclamation line, and we knew it. As a modern example, take a look at your current southern border. It's wide open desert, it's flat as a pancake, it's got a river that in the dry season you can walk across. You have fences and roads and modern sensing technology and drones, and you still can't control that border. In my time, there was no chance that the British could have enforced this proclamation line of 1763. Western settlement was very crucial to the economic development of the West. People on the frontier needed access to free land. And it's hard to think of in the modern age because there is no land that is free in the United States of America now. Every square inch of land, and I'm not exaggerating, every square inch of land in the United States of America is owned by somebody today. If you want land in America, you have to have the resources to purchase it. That wasn't the case in my time. The land was free for the taking. All you had to do was go west and make a claim. And you did that by blazing the trees to mark the corners of your land. And blazing simply meant taking your tomahawk or an axe and stripping a strip of bark off the tree to expose the white wood underneath the bark. So trailblazers, that's the same way that you marked a trail. That's where the term trail blazing comes from. It's marking a trail by blazing the trees. And for those of you who are involved with horses, you know that if you have a horse that has a white mark on its forehead, that's known as a blaze. That's because it looks exactly the same way that a blaze was that we used to mark property and trails back in my time. So that's all you had to do to claim land. You just had to find a piece that you liked, mark it by blazing, and it was yours. Now, keeping your land was a completely different story, because once the land speculators and the surveyors came out and the lawyers, the people on the frontier who made their claims by blazing always lost them. Claiming land was easy, keeping it was very difficult. But just the same, the ability to do that was crucial to economic development for people on the frontier. Most of these people were illiterate. They had little to no education. Many of them didn't have trades that they could fall back on, and free land was the key to their ability to improve their station in life. If you take that away, you have absolutely stifled the growth of the frontier, and the people on the frontier weren't going to stand for that. So they ignored the British proclamation line because they knew it couldn't be enforced. So they continued to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains into Kentucky. And the general route that they would take is to go to Fort Pitt, get on riverboats, canoes or pirogues. That's just a flat bottom riverboat. And they would take the boats downriver to wherever their desired destination was and start a settlement. Now, the British knew that we were doing that, and they also knew that there was nothing they could do to stop it. So they turned a blind eye to it and just ignored the problem. And that was fine up until the American Revolution started. Now, also let me go back a little bit here, and I want to explain too that this entire region was claimed by Virginia. The normal course of action was for the colonies to take their northern and southern boundaries and project them due west until they hit the Mississippi River and claim that for their later westward expansion. Virginia didn't play nice. What Virginia did is it did that with its southern border with North Carolina, but for the northern border that bordered Maryland and Pennsylvania here, they projected it west until it crossed the Appalachians, and then they took it due north to the tip of the Great Lakes. And they claimed all of this region for Virginia, and they originally called the entire region Fincastle County. That lasted until 1774. By 1774, there were so many settlers now living in Kentucky that they petitioned to become their own county in Virginia. So they sent 2 delegates to represent the people of Kentucky. And by the way, there were other settlers in Kentucky. There were North Carolinians there were Pennsylvanians, Marylanders, but the vast majority of people in Kentucky were Virginians. So there came to be so many Virginians, they wanted to be their own county. So they elected 2 delegates to go to Williamsburg, which at that time was the capital of Virginia, in order to petition for Kentucky to be adopted as an independent county. One of those 2 people that we sent was none other than George Rogers Clark himself. So their petition was successful and Kentucky was adopted as an official county. So now, out of the old Fincastle County, you've now carved out Kentucky County. So after Kentucky County has been removed, they need to rename the remainder of the old Fincastle County, and it is named Illinois County. So at the time of the Revolution, Kentucky and Illinois are 2 counties that belong to the colony and later the state of Virginia. And when they say Illinois County, they're not talking just about the modern day state of Illinois. They're talking about the remainder of this entire northwest region. It was all collectively known then as the Illinois Territory. So now Kentucky is recognized as its own county in 1774. It is continuing to increase in population, and then the next year the war breaks out. So when the American Revolution starts, the British can no longer ignore this large and rapidly growing population on its frontier. And they make the mistake of thinking that that is a hostile population. One of the things that in modern times you misunderstand about the American Revolution is that all Americans were in favor of it, and that's not true. There was only ever a third of us that were in favor of independence. There was an equal third that was in favor of remaining loyal subjects of the king, and there was another third that didn't care much either way how the revolution turned out. A large percentage of that third that didn't care was on the frontier. They just wanted to be left alone to live their lives. Had the British left well enough alone, they would have found that they didn't really have a hostile group of people on their frontier. But they couldn't leave it alone. We were there in violation of the law, and they wanted to enforce that law. Now, they also knew that the revolution has now started, and they can't divert any of the crown forces that they need to fight the newly formed Continental Army and the various state forces that were arrayed against them in the eastern seaboard. In fact, they couldn't even do that by themselves. They had to hire German Hessian mercenaries to augment their crown forces to fight us in the eastern seaboard. There was absolutely no way that they could divert the amount of troops that they would need to enforce their proclamation line of 1763 and drive the settlers back across it. So they hired mercenaries again. And this time the mercenaries that they hired to fight their proxy war on the frontier were the Indians who lived in the region. And they were happy to do it because none of them were very happy with the American presence in Kentucky anyways. So the British hired the Indians to fight this proxy war on the frontier. And the way that it worked is the Indians were doing it for payment. Out of this entire northwest region, it was administered from Detroit here. That is where the British military governor was ensconced, and his name was Henry Hamilton. And we called him the hair buyer for reasons that I'll get to shortly. So the entire region is administered by Henry Hamilton up here in Detroit, and the British also control outposts in the southern part of this region. They have Cahokia and Kaskaskia, which are here on the Mississippi River, and then they have Vincennes, which is here on the Wabash River. From those outposts, they would pay the Indians who successfully raided the Kentucky settlements. So the Indians would raid into Kentucky from their various villages. They would kill all the Americans that they could get their hands on, and they killed without regard to age, sex, or condition. They weren't just targeting military-age men. They were killing women, children, the elderly, the sick. They killed absolutely everybody because the proof that they had killed an American was by taking a scalp. And a scalp is a scalp is a scalp. There's no difference between the scalp of a young girl and the scalp of a military-age man. So they killed nearly everybody that they could get their hands on. Sometimes they would take you prisoner, but usually if they did, it was just to take you back to their village to torture you to death for sport and entertainment. Sometimes, if you were a high-value prisoner, they might take you for use in a later prisoner exchange or to try and adopt you into their tribe. An example of that is Daniel Boone. He was captured by the Indians. They were going to adopt him into their tribe. He subsequently later escaped and made it back to his settlement. But for the most part, you could count on the Indians killing you because they wanted your scalp. Your scalp was a blood chit, and it was payment for them, so they weren't going to let any scalps go by. So they would then take these scalps to these various outposts, Vincennes, Kaskaskia, Cahokia, sometimes if they were from the region up to Detroit, but mostly it was these southern outposts, and they would exchange them for the trade goods that they needed to sustain and improve their lives on the frontier. So they would trade scalps for things like blankets, other woven goods, cooking pots, trade muskets, gunpowder, gun flints, lead, beads, mirrors, alcohol. That is what the life of a Kentucky settler was reduced to, was their scalp being exchanged for trade goods. It got so bad that by the end of 1777, which we referred to as the year of the Bloody Sevens, Kentucky was almost completely wiped out. It was reduced to just 3 remaining settlements around the Kentucky River here. There was Boonesboro, which was founded by Daniel Boone. There was Harrodstown and Logan's Station, or Logan's Fort. It goes by both names. And that was it. All that was left of Kentucky were those 3. Every other settlement in Kentucky had been burned out, and the settlers had either been killed, forced to flee back east for safety, or they were forting up in one of those 3 remaining outposts. Kentucky was hanging on by a thread, and those 3 outposts were under almost constant siege. And that is where George Rogers Clark enters the picture. Now, George Rogers Clark was a Virginian, and he was a surveyor by trade. He was a member of the Virginia gentry, and he had been living in Kentucky. As I mentioned before, he was one of the delegates that the settlers of Kentucky sent to Virginia to petition for Kentucky to be adopted as a county of Virginia. So George Rogers Clark hatches a plan. He correctly concludes that the Indians are mercenaries. They're fighting because they're being paid to fight. And if you interrupt that system of payment, they'll cease the fight. He also knew from his experience in Lord Dunmore's war back in '74 that trying to attack Indians in their own country is a very difficult thing to do. In order to be stealthful enough to sneak up on them without them being aware of your arrival, you have to have a very small force. And if you have a small force and you're detected, they'll wait an ambush for you and wipe you out. If you have a large enough force to avoid being ambushed by them, they'll simply evacuate their village before you get there, and when you get there, there's no battle to be fought and nothing significant to destroy. So Clark knew that trying to take the fight to Indians in their own country was not feasible. Instead, he decided that interrupting the system of payments was the best way to go about this. So he took this plan to Williamsburg at the end of 1777, and he met with Governor Patrick Henry. Now, you all have heard of Patrick Henry. This is Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death, Patrick Henry, the same man. He was the first elected governor of Virginia. After the last royal governor, Lord Dunmore, had fled for his life, Patrick Henry was elected as the first governor. Clark takes his plan to Henry and asks for approval. And Henry wants the counsel of some of the other leading members of the Virginia political class. He doesn't want to inform the entire House of Burgesses because in order for this plan to succeed, it has to be done in the utmost secrecy, and there are simply too many mouths in the House of Burgesses to keep this a secret. So instead, he calls a meeting with some of his select counselors to review this plan. And this meeting consisted of Patrick Henry, George Rogers Clark, Thomas Jefferson, George Wythe, and George Mason. And those were the men who decided the fate of what would become the Northwest Territory. They decided that Clark's plan was sound, and they authorized the formation of a regiment. Now, what they authorized was the raising of 7 companies of 50 men each. That would have only equaled 350 men if it was recruited at full strength. Now, that is not a regiment. That is about the size of a battalion. So when we called ourselves the Illinois Regiment, we were a regiment in name only. At full strength, we would have been about the size of a battalion, and as it turned out, we were never able to recruit anywhere close to our authorized strength. The other thing that Henry did is he issued two sets of orders for recruitment. There was the public orders and there was the private orders. Now, I mentioned before that people on the frontier were relatively disengaged from the events in the East. It was hard to recruit them to fight. And also keep in mind that all recruiters were pulling from the same pool of available men. So the Continental Army, the various state regiments, along with the militia, and now this new Illinois Frontier Regiment, were all trying to pull from the same group of men. So recruiting was difficult. So the public orders that we used to recruit our companies based on essentially said that we were going to go into Indian country and take the fight to the Indians. There was bloodlust on the frontier for the tribes that were hostile to us and had been raiding Kentucky. There was not a family in Kentucky that hadn't been touched by the violence. If they hadn't had a member of their immediate family killed, they knew somebody who had. So telling them that we are going to go and now take the fight to the Indians was a great motivation. Of course, that was not Clark's plan at all, but he knew he needed to tell that white lie in order to raise enough men to make this campaign possible. The other thing we did is we promised a land grant of 300 acres of land to any man who would complete his term. And as I mentioned before, it was easy for frontiersmen to claim land. It was very difficult for them to keep land. The thing about this 300-acre land grant is this was promised by the state of Virginia. So it was going to come to you with full title and deed, and you didn't have to worry about it being stolen from you later. So that 300 acres of land was a very serious inducement in order to recruit our forces. So after Clark's plan was accepted, he then appointed 4 company commanders, and I, Joseph Bowman, was one of those initial company commanders, and we were sent to the respective areas that we came from to recruit our companies. The plan was that after recruiting our companies, we were all to reconvene in the Redstone settlement in the spring. By the way, when Patrick Henry approved this plan, it was early January 1778. We were to convene that spring in the Redstone settlement just south of Fort Pitt here, and that was where we were going to kick off the campaign.